Right, yes, let's invite the rest of the panelists to come and join the panel. So welcome back, David, Rosalind and Sandrine, to join Angela and myself. Thank you. Wonderful. All right, so I'm really hoping there are going to be some questions from the floor. You can either hide in the chat or you can put a digital hand up, and if I see a digital hand go up, I will invite you to verbally join the conversation. But just to kick things off, obviously I've got a number of questions myself. So that's given us a really good overview of Agile. Where do you think our industry is going to be with Agile in 3 years from now? Is everybody going to be trialing it, or are there some organizations where Agile really will not culturally fit? So I don't know, these are your crystal balls. What do you think? 5 years, maybe 3 to 5 years from now. So Rosalind, you're wiping your lips, and that gives me a hint that you're desperate to speak.
It's more thinking intensively. I think it's realistically, although everything in terms of implementation is moving faster now, I think there are going to be degrees of maturity depending on the industry, and I think some industries will adopt this faster than others. I think we referenced already, so those that are working in technology environments or perhaps biotech, those that really have that drive to get to solutions and unknown outcomes more rapidly, are probably going to start to adopt this faster. Perhaps where I've seen some challenges, I've worked with a couple of organizations in the manufacturing side where the projects are potentially less obvious that could benefit so substantially from agile sourcing, less obvious to the company as opposed to rather less obvious to me. So I'm very much, and my idea about this is it's more about the requirement and the outcome than necessarily the sector. I think there still will be a place for, when I say traditional sourcing and procurement, I think that's going to change as well, because that's going to be very much more technology and AI driven, etc., and all of the tools out there. But that's a very long-winded way of saying I think we're still going to be on the journey in 3 years' time, and there will become those that are more of the evangelists that can start to help and coach. And I think Angela's right. There is a definite need for coaching here. To start to deploy this across more industries, but definitely technology, anything to do with research are going to be those that are going to embrace this more rapidly, I think.
I agree, and I think I would add to that list kind of core business process. I know business process is perhaps more challenging and perhaps lagging behind technology in the adoption of this, but I think that's certainly an area that we're seeing emerging. But I think the traditional sourcing of commodities, components, tin, wires, fence posts, ingredients, whatever it is, I think those will be later adopters. The benefit of collaboration and relationship with those kind of suppliers, where probably the focus is pretty much on price, will be laggards, I think, in the process. I agree with Rosalind, the benefits are there. I just think procurement teams will, where they focus on price, will see less benefit associated with building relationships and collaborating and so on.
David, you're on mute. You're still on mute. We've lost your audio. No.
Now?
Yes, got you.
Okay, that's weird because it's not muted on the screen, so I have no idea what's going on. I've played with the wire on my headset, so maybe that's fixed it. Sorry for delay. All I was going to say is I totally agree with Rosalind and Angela, and I think that what we're seeing is, because we get involved in quite a lot of complex services and CX deals and BPO services, and we're trying to encourage procurement and sourcing leaders to say, if you carry on buying in the way that you've always bought, then you're going to get what you always got. And actually, if you start thinking about more complex services that we're looking to deliver with the implementation of technology, moving away from just the traditional models, you have to buy it in a different way. And therefore, I think you will see certain services moving much more to a modern sourcing or agile model. But if you're buying a commodity, what's, I suppose people would say, what's, if it's not broke, don't fix it, and actually focus on the more complicated services deals for a model like this.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Sandrine, I'm really keen to get your perspective as to how broadly used do you think it's going to be within Galapagos, given the experience you've had so far?
Yeah, I think it's we need this proof of concept first, like this pilot and finding the right project and show that it's working. And then it's a lot of changing mindset, because the traditional way of doing the sourcing is so embedded in everyone and in all the buyers, that that's also really important to see how we can educate the people, even like externally and internally with the stakeholders as well. A lot of education, a lot of coaching is needed. But if we have a champion in agile sourcing, then it will help the organization to get into their fits on that.
Excellent, thank you. Right, I'm going to take the questions in the order that they've come on in. So I'm going to invite you first, Colleen, if you could briefly introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yeah, of course. Hi, I'm Colleen, Vice President of Business Development at Teleperformance. So we do a lot of customer experience outsourcing in the BPO industry. And I think actually David's touched on some of what I was going to ask. What we see is, particularly in the commercial sector, is people trying to compare apples with apples, but in a 2-week time frame. So they're really pushing, and they think that Agile is doing it quickly and at the speed of light. And it's not always comparing apples with apples, because I think what we find a challenge is that some of the clients or prospects that come to us don't understand or don't know enough about everything that is happening in their business, or can't get that information. And I think this goes back to, again, Dave, I think you made the point about when they're trying to do transformational things, they are trying to get to that because they think it's the right place to go, without maybe having the detail to say, this is where I'm trying to go. And I suppose my question to all of this then is, how do you influence pre-RFP or in RFP where you can influence it? And again, we do see it in public sector as well, where they come out for a service that they think they need, but they also want added extras or options. And I think that makes it really challenging at times.
Okay, great. So I'm going to ask Angela, maybe you could take that question first.
Yeah, so sorry, Colleen, can you just recap on the question? You gave some very good explanation and background, but
I think is, how do you influence ahead of an RFP or during an RFP that potentially what they're asking for, or the direction that they think they're going, either isn't agile or isn't going to get the transformational outcome that they're looking for in the way that they're doing it?
Yeah, so I would certainly, begin, as I said, with the end in mind, and have the discussions with the client about what good looks like. What are their desired outcomes? What do they want to get from this process? And to design a sourcing process that enables that to happen. So whether that is an RFP or whether it is a more agile sourcing approach, to ensure that the whole approach is driven to deliver those outcomes. I think you touched on public sector, and of course it's always more more difficult in public sector, but it is entirely possible, to articulate requirements in a data room as kind of outcomes, outputs from the process, but still enter into dialogue around the transformative aspects of it. So, you know, perhaps adopting a more hybrid approach where, you know, some things are documented, understood as core and mandatory requirements, and other things are developed and explored. But, you know, to your point earlier, this is, you know, Agile sourcing does not allow you to compare apples and apples. You know, that is the whole point of it. You know, you're creating a fruit salad, not apples and apples. And, you know, your whole sourcing process and evaluation process has to take into account that very complex fact that, you know, you can't score everybody against the same criteria if you want that transformation and innovation.
And what I would say, Colleen, just Kerry, if you're right, if I give a like a practical experience, would be, and it's a dangerous thing to say on this audience probably, but I think sourcing and procurement people are typically fairly cynical. Maybe I shouldn't say that, and we're not physical, so no one's going to hit me, and I've been one, so I can say that. And I think there is a risk from you, and I know you said Colleen and Teleperformance, which is if you were trying to influence me when I was a sourcing person, I'd be thinking, well, they're trying to influence me in what I'm buying. So I think a practical way would be to do it would be maybe to point at people such as, I know, Everest or anyone on this panel in terms of what's happening in the market and what people are doing with agile sourcing versus trying to tell them, oh, you should be doing it this way, because I think cynical buyers would be like, you're trying to position it in this way because that's going to make you successful as Teleperformance, versus, well, actually that's what the industry's doing. So whether it's anything that GSA's produced or Horizon 7 or ourselves or Rosalind and her team, it will be about, well, we're trying to showcase what the industry's doing so they can discover that for themselves and the benefits they would get from doing a more modern sourcing or agile model. And that would help them to buy the complex services they need versus it being something you're pushing, because they may think, well, that's just because you're trying to push this in your direction. So just a real world cynical view.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I can imagine it can be incredibly frustrating. You know, going through an RFP process is so time consuming and costly as it is. And then when you can see that you're heading towards a car crash because they're not actually, you know, adopting the process properly, must be, must be very frustrating. So yes, point them in the direction of the GSA and our best practice. So that's what you want. Right, over to you, Mr. Holward. Chris.
Thank you, Kerry. Just so that people know who I am, I do work with the GSA as Associate Director of Learning, and I also work as a sourcing consultant as well. So I guess the question that I had to the panelists, and he perhaps picks up on what Dave was just saying there, really, and I think the final iteration of the question, because it's gone through a few over the past couple of minutes, is about what is the problem that Agile is looking to solve? Who has that problem? And is this a case, and very much picking up on what Dave, you were just saying, is it a case that, you know, Agile is trying to create a need rather than simply responding to, you know, a very clear problem that exists and that certain people have? And I'm really interested to understand who those people are. Just one last point, and hopefully I'm not making the question overly complex, but I guess I'm coming at it from those two angles. That as a sourcing consultant, I'm always keen to do what's right for my client. So who is it that I'm likely to be engaging with who should be thinking about agile sourcing? And then putting my GSA Associate Director of Learning hat on, if I'm trying to create a program of learning, who is it that's aimed at? Who do I need to help to learn about agile sourcing? There's a lot there, I know.
Kerry, could I respond to the first part of that, which is the kind of what is the problem? Why are we doing this? And, you know, I think certainly our research, and I'm sure David and Rosalind's experience would also support this. Sorry, am I still? I thought I froze for a moment. Is that, you know, clients enter into outsourcing relationships through traditional means, and you know, everyone has the best will in the world that it's going to work out. But actually, you know, 3 years, 5 years down the line, people are sitting there going, this hasn't given me what I set out to achieve. You know, it's not working the way I thought it should be working. Why not? What's gone wrong? And actually, our research shows that, you know, that comes down to the relationship, the culture, the understanding, the empathy that exists between the parties and their willingness to want to iterate even during contract and make things work. It's not down to the RFP and the contract and the SLAs. And the only way of evaluating in the first place and starting to build that relationship and culture is through the collaborative and iterative approaches that Agile brings. So to me, that's the problem we're trying to solve. We're trying to solve, you know, why outsourcing relationships are generally deemed not to succeed, and how do we adopt a process that rectifies those, you know, flaws, if you like, in the arm's length requirements driven RFP approach.
And if I may, Kerry, if I may jump in and give the perspective from my previous life, as opposed to my life now advising people to do agile sourcing. From my life as a CPO, I would list the top 3 pain points that I dealt with on a, I'd like to say daily, possibly hourly basis with my internal business customers. Was firstly, the quality of the information, the data. So we'll set that aside. That's a different topic altogether, but how accurate our data was. The second was how long our processes took, how long my procurement team took to take from an identification of a need through to a contract, and they'd already spoken to so-and-so and they could do that in 6 weeks, etc. Why are you so slow and why do you sit behind all of this paperwork? The third then was at the end of the process where they said, well, this service and this contract does not meet the requirements that we originally thought we were going to go out to market for. What we've got from the supplier is not what we expected. It bears no relation, and the contract doesn't help us as supporters in defining that differently. So for me, I kind of wish this had come along a little bit earlier in my career, because fighting off those 2 consistent and actually quite accurate complaints against my procurement functions presented a challenge. And if I had had the ability to deploy more agile techniques, not necessarily a slave to the entire process, because I think that's what, you know, I'm really keen to, I think we're all very keen to say, and to enable that business customer to be far more collaborative in building that requirement, building what the outcome looks like, being a part of the outcome that they're expecting to achieve, would really have solved 2 out of 3 of my main problems. And maybe I'd still be a CPO rather than an advisor if that was the case.
That's great. I'm really interested to get your perspective on this as well, Sandrine. So obviously you are embarking upon the journey because obviously there is a problem. So could you re-articulate?
Yeah, and I think for innovation, it's really maybe the way to go with, because usually we have an objective or outcome, but we don't know how to get there. And we need to work on the trust, that trusting, you know, the suppliers, for instance, like trusting the design that they will bring up on the outcome. And as we say, it's a fruit salad, because each supplier will come with different way of on the solution to the outcome. But the thing is, it will really bring this collaboration together, and making sure that for innovation is really key, because the stakeholders, they don't know how we will go through the outcomes that we want. Maybe some category where people are sure about themselves, like the internal stakeholder, they sure about their requirements and everything. It's maybe different perspective, but still, I think it can work as well, because we need to have like the supplier view. For the moment, with some internal stakeholders is always difficult, because they think that they know everything, that they know how to get to the outcome and the requirements. But by just listening to the suppliers, with the business, and talking all together, we might find another solution that can work better. So that's also something that I have in mind. And I think the second question is about the training, or who has to be trained. I think procurement can be really like good champions on that, explaining how it works. But I think that the procurement community, if I see it at Galapagos, we are still really traditional. For us, really, when I talk to my colleagues, it's like, oh, you need to be more flexible. No, agile sourcing is not just being flexible. It's another methodology, another way and approach. But I think, yeah, the way that I see the team is, we want like the junior, they just want to be good in RFPs and traditional way, because it's how they build the experience, right? And for the director, or we need to work on this business, partnering with the business to bring it up, to explain what does it mean, and bring it more consciously to the community around us.
Okay, so I think what we're hearing is really, as with most outsourcing, is there's got to be a cultural fit. It's got to almost be led from the top to actually ensure that this is all embraced and delivered properly. Okay, right, we've got some questions in the chat. I don't know if you guys have got the chat open, but I'll read it in case. So Naz is asking, and I think this moves on quite nicely from the conversation we're just having, really. How do you balance buyer certainty of fixed price and agility of time and material? So I think it's just really looking at, when you've got Agile, how do you actually cost it correctly? So anybody want to take that one?
I think the pricing mechanism is not in itself dependent upon the sourcing mechanism. RFPs can be for fixed price or for T&M. Agile sourcing, can do both of those, but can also perhaps develop creative and different ways of pricing. Outcome-based, alliance, JVs, all sorts of different contracting and pricing mechanisms. I would say the two are not directly linked. The pricing mechanism can be explored and developed through agile sourcing to achieve the desired outcomes. And equally, you can get fixed price and T&M through RFPs.
So I don't know if I didn't articulate that question correctly, but Naz has now put her hand up. So Naz, please introduce yourself.
Hi, it's Naz and Jimmy. We are together here.
Hi there.
So we are Agile and Digital Consultancy, and we work a lot in that space. We provide Agile coaching, consulting, and also software outsourcing. And myself, as an Agile coach, I've been very, very close to the topic, and I'm not one of the skeptics, like David said. I've been advocating Agile procurement for a very long time. And Angela, you touched on what I meant by the question, but for me, more was we often see RFPs and procurement bids for 2-3 year long projects. And anyone who knows anything about agility, you cannot even plan for half a year long project properly, yet alone 3 year long project.
Yeah,
right?
I agree, Naz, and I think that's where not only the procurement approach, but the contracting approach is key. And Sandrine and Rosalind touched on agile contracting, sprint-based contracting, or PI-based contracting, which I think is where you contract for what you know. So, the agile methodology, whether that's Scrum, Scaled Agile, etc., and the ways of working and the roles and responsibilities of the party. And you contract for the first series of sprints, PIs, whatever that might be. And for the overall kind of window of cost, time, whatever it is that's driving the project. And then as you go through iterations and you know, planning and so on, you contract on a, you know, a periodic basis for what you next know to be the case. So if you were doing PI planning, you'd be looking at the PI objectives and some committed outcomes through the Agile contracting process, and maybe some optional objectives where, you know, if the sprint is the velocity is higher and you're able to deliver more than was contracted, that you have the ability to do that. But you do it on a piecemeal basis. And whether that's fixed price, T&M, PI objective-based pricing, you know, etc., I think the pricing mechanism depends on what, you know, your project and what you're trying to achieve. But I think Agile contracting, you know, very definitely lines up to digital projects, Agile projects, and Agile development methodologies.
Okay, thank you.
But I can also just reply quickly, because it's it was one of my first questions to Rosalind as well. Like, how, yeah, okay, I understand the Agile principle, but how can I make sure that I'm doing my buyer work, right? How can I make sure that procurement will have added value, and have those pricing, because it was so, yeah, gray zone for me. How do I do that? And so I need to put aside my traditional way of thinking and think differently and say, okay, if we are in a collaborative way of working, more on a trust, so that's something that I have to, you know, change myself and just put that in aside and say, okay, I want to try. So it's a tryout. It can be a mistake or not, but that's why the project that you will select is really important, because it cannot like be a the project of the company. Otherwise, it's a lot of risk and a lot of pressure. But you have to try out and see how it works. And so what we discuss as well is like the first project that I have, we talk about, you know, even like fixed price with incentive, like, because we wanted to, we have an objective, and if they have a success in that objective, we go through. If not, we're not paying them. That's quite intense. And then I was like talking about this Agile contracting, and we were like, okay, can I do it in time and material? Is it like another way to do the pricing? And Rosalind was like, yeah, sure. Just talk with the vendor and see how you will build it collaboratively. And so that's really something that maybe I need the coach to come back on it each time, because my traditional way is always like there, you know, like say, yeah, you have to do some savings, make sure about the pricing, negotiate it well. But then she's like back and say about, you know, how I have to collaborate and do it collectively, but with the business as well. Then everyone is on the same basis and understand it together.
I'm really glad you mentioned trust, because I think that's the biggest problem when it comes to Agile contracting.
Yeah.
Well, lack of it.
Agreed.
And that's why Sandrine's one of our favorite clients.
So that leads on quite nicely to another question that Rashmi has posted. So in Agile sourcing, what is the approach to commitment with an uncertain scope? i.e., can a supplier be selected with iterative commitment as scope develops? So yeah, that might be really, really quite tricky. It's like you really like the beginning of this project and you've got the right skill sets for it, but by the end, it's not a program you really want to be involved in. But you're in that can be quite dangerous for both the buyer and the service provider, couldn't it? So so what's who would like to take that question?
I'm happy to kick that off. I mean, I think Agile sourcing is all about going into that commitment with an uncertain scope. It works most effectively when you're both building something together. So what it does mean, and I think both Angela and David referenced this earlier, you don't go into this as a hands-off process with 5 or 6 vendors where you are, you know, doing a paper-based exercise for them to demonstrate their capabilities. You're investing a lot more up front in determining that you are going to work possibly with 2, but one or two vendors, if you're in the agile sourcing part, that you fundamentally have assessed that organization, that they have the capability and the competence and the will and the appetite to build an iterative development together. The scope will change. Do they have that flexibility? Is it in their wheelhouse? Have they had experience of this? So there is a lot more upfront appreciation and understanding and due diligence of selecting a partner or partners who can demonstrate that they can deliver against this kind of very iterative process of both the sourcing and then the ongoing development and changes in scope. I think the second thing I would say as well is if you're actually looking in the agile contracting phase, again, you would hope that you've selected a framework partner or a partner that you'll do it working in a particular program with, who also has this capability, and you're in a strong relationship. And fundamental to this, underpinning every aspect of agile, whether it's agile sourcing or contract, is relationship and relationship management. And whether we call that immersion, collaboration, there are still some very good old-fashioned principles of making sure that you are still working towards the same outcomes and goals. Now, are there going to be times where maybe if that's a very long project, they may move in different ways? Of course, this is not ideal. It's not a panacea to every outsourcing arrangement out there. But I think, it's crucial that actually you are joined up in working out that it is going to be iterative and the scope will change.
And Kerry, just to quickly add, and this sort of addresses Chris's question as well, I think the second part of his question, in terms of who needs to be aware of things like agile sourcing, I think it's not just the sourcing procurement teams, but you need to let people like legal and finance know, because these type of iterative processes aren't common for what maybe they're used to. And so the awareness of, if you're going to change and move more to a more agile sourcing approach, there are other people that need to know within the business, because you suddenly go, oh, it's going to be iterative, and legal might freak out and say, well, we need the contract tied down to the nth degree, and that's not what you're signing up for. So it goes back to who needs to be aware. So there's an awareness campaign that would need to be done as well.
Totally, David. I mean, finance is another of those practices. Finance like known budgets. They like certainty and predictability and so on. And of course, this potentially, sort of you're contracting for unknown outcomes. You're also contracting for unknown, financial situations. And yes, you can put some boundaries around that and, certainty where you can, but nonetheless, it's a huge cultural change from a governance and sort of financial management perspective in an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that goes on to the question from Celso is how do you, can't quite read it, it's my camera's in the way. How do you ensure effective communication and collaboration between the outsourcing team and the in-house team? So it's all about relationships, isn't it? But how do you ensure that you keep the relationship on track?
With the internal stakeholders?
Yeah, between the
I think there's various tiers of that. I mean, first of all, I would engage, many of those people in the sourcing process itself, so if you're running discussions around the contract, you may have the lawyers in the room or certainly heavily engaged in the process. On the pricing aspects, the financial people, etc. So I think there's direct engagement in the process, but there's also the kind of whole stakeholder management and communications part of it, and making sure that, the key stakeholders in the organization know what's happening, know what's required of them, when those decision points are being reached, that they're able to mobilize at the pace and give the responses that are needed from the business. So it is an investment, and it definitely has to be managed alongside the kind of core procurement aspect of that process.
And do you think the occasional blocker in any of those sort of like silos could actually send Agile completely off track?
For sure. Yeah. Hence the importance, as Chris was talking about, who do we need to educate and train in this, and also the kind of coaching, governance changes, etc., that are required throughout the organization. And yes, absolutely, they can derail the process. You know, you get stakeholders halfway down the process who go, what do you mean you haven't got my favorite supplier in this process? I want them. Introducing back into the process. But those things happen in any procurement, you know, and you just have to handle them as they arise, but ideally preventative action with stakeholder mapping, communications and engagement.
Okay, and the question from Vic is, do we think that this whole sort of like working from home approach that we've now got and new technologies, were they going to benefit the adoption of Agile or be a negative?
I think they change it. I don't think they either disable it or enable it particularly more significantly. I think this is just a fact now. You know, we do have that increase in working from home. I do like, if at all possible, for some of the Agile sessions to be face to face, because I think true collaboration, understanding and teamwork is much easier to achieve in a face-to-face engagement where human beings, we like to relate to each other in that way. But I have run, as I'm sure have others here, processes where that has never happened. Distributed Agile teams being a good example on the supply side. Where that doesn't happen, and the use of collaboration tools and techniques is important in that situation. So it changes it, but I don't think either is better or worse. They are just facts and constraints that we work with.
Right, well, we've answered everyone's questions and we are absolutely at time. So I would like to thank everybody for taking the time out to join and present and join the panel, and everybody in the audience for the participation and for the questions. It's been very interesting. I think we could have gone on for significantly longer, but the good news is that this is just the beginning. So Rosalind's going to be working on the GSA Council on the best practice, leading a work stream on Agile sourcing. So this will be the first of many sort of webinars, discussions, with the end goal being that by the end of 2023, we will, won't we, Rosalind? We will have developed the GSA's view on the best practice guide to Agile sourcing. So please do, get in touch with me and let me know if you'd like to get involved in that working group. We'd be delighted to have as many contributors as possible into this really important subject. I think we're going to see Agile being adopted significantly more across our industry. So if you're not on board, you need to get on board to actually understanding the benefits, because they are numerous. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, Angela, David, Rosalind and Sandrine, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.